Dr. Nikki Ashcraft holds a master's degree in teaching English to speakers of other languages and a PhD in adult education. She is currently an associate teaching professor in the online Masters of Education TESOL program at the University of Missouri, where she enjoys working with English teachers around the world. During her career, she has taught ESL and EFL and trained teachers in the US, Mexico, Chile, Kuwait, and the United Arab Emirates. So please join me in welcoming Nikki. And I'm turning it over to you, Nikki.
Thank you, Cynthia. And I also want to share with everyone that I actually live in Frisco. So that's sometimes confusing for people. They're like, oh, you came all the way from Missouri for this? I actually live in Frisco, and I am involved in doing teacher training with a number of adult literacy programs in the DFW area. So our topic today is differentiation in multi-level classrooms. And you see the image that I posted here on this introductory slide. And I chose this image because to me, the building represents our students' English language proficiency. And you see that there are the multiple doors and the stairways going from one level to the next. And to me, this represented that students can enter English language or they can enter into our lessons at different levels. And so that's what we're going to be talking about today, is how we can facilitate students' access to our lessons when they are at different levels of English language proficiency. So I'd like to start out first, before we get into the differentiation part, I would like to start by talking about what do we mean by multi-level, and more specifically, what do we mean by level? Because many times we hear these terms thrown around. Oh, this student is a beginner, this student is intermediate, this student is advanced. And what does that actually mean? Sometimes we have different perceptions or definitions of those terms. I have volunteered before in an adult ESL program where they had two levels. So the first level was beginner and the next level was advanced. So students were in the beginner level for maybe one semester or 1 year, and then they were in the advanced level. So were those students, though, in the advanced level, were they really advanced by a recognized definition of what advanced means in our field? Could they write an essay? Could they write a job application letter? Could they read a book or read a newspaper on their own? Most likely not, because they really had only had 1 year of English language instruction. So it was a little inaccurate to say that those students were advanced. But the students would go around saying, oh, I'm in the advanced class. And it could also give them a misperception of what their proficiency was, because when they go to apply for a job and they have to fill out on the application, what is your level of proficiency in English or another language? And they might say, I'm advanced. So I think we need to be very careful about how we label a student's language proficiency and use a recognized scale when we talk about language proficiency. So I'm going to share some of those scales with you now, and I encourage you to become familiar with these scales or to choose one for your own program so that everyone talks about proficiency in the same way. So I'm just going to show you two, but there are actually a number of different scales. So this is the CASAS scale, and some of you might use CASAS in your program. You might use the CASAS proficiency test or books that are aligned with the CASAS. So for example, the textbook side by side is aligned with CASAS skill descriptor levels. And you can see that this scale has the 7 levels. One is at 7. I'm trying to move my little zoom thing here. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 levels here. And this scale starts with beginning literacy and pre-beginning ELL. And I know you can't see all the details of this right now on your screen. I am going to put the link in the chat in a moment so you can explore these scales more in detail. But you see that this scale, the CASA scale, begins with those pre-literate students. So it starts at a very low level with students who we might also call zero proficiency, students who have not had any exposure to English, and they are unable to write in English, and they might also be illiterate in their first language as well. So those students are really developing those basic literacy skills. And then it goes to low beginning, where the students are starting to develop literacy. They are starting to be able to talk about their personal information, describe their daily routines, and then it goes up from there. And this scale goes up to what they call proficient. But the proficient is described here as more work-related, being able to participate in social situations. And we'll see different scales have a different upper limit. So this is one scale that you might be able to adapt in your program when you're talking about your students' English language proficiency. Another scale is the CEFR, which is the Common European Framework of Reference. And this scale is used, as you can imagine, it says European, is used throughout Europe for many different languages, not just English. And you see here that it has 6 levels. Now the A1 level is the lowest level, and you will see if you read that descriptor that it is not as low as the descriptor for the lowest level on the CASAS. So the CEFR starts a little bit higher, and it also ends at a higher level. If you see the descriptor for the C2, what that person is able to do with language, it says they can understand with ease virtually everything they hear or read. They can summarize information from different sources. They can reconstruct arguments, express themselves spontaneously and precisely, understanding nuances. So this is a very high level of proficiency. And I'm going to go back to the CASAS. You can compare it to what the CASAS says. It just says participate effectively in social and familiar work situations, understand and participate in practical and social conversations, technical discussions in their own field. So the CASAS highest level on CASAS is not quite as high as the highest level on the CEFR. So these two proficiency scales, they overlap, but I'm trying to illustrate them here. So this hand is the CASAS and this hand is the CEFR. So the CASAS starts lower and ends lower, and the CEFR starts higher and ends higher. But there is some overlap there in the middle, and I want to show you an example of that. So here are some descriptors. The first one from the CASAS and the second one from CEFR. And I'm going to give you a minute here I want to count in my head, to read these two descriptors and to see where are the areas of overlap and how this level is described. So I'm going to just pause for a minute here and let you read this and see what are the commonalities between these two definitions. So I invite you, if you'd like to post in the chat, what are some areas of overlap that you see between these two definitions of this proficiency level? Familiar and routine topics, simple, frequently used expressions. Right, so students are able to talk about their daily lives, things that they do on a regular basis, things that are concrete. Yes, personal information. So even though what I wanted you to see is that even though these are two different scales and they might use different terminology for how they label the proficiency level, CASAS says low intermediate ELL, CEFR calls it A2, that there still is a standard way of thinking about what students can do at this proficiency level. And so it's important for us to get familiar with not all of these skills, but at least one or two of these skills. So we have a better sense when we say somebody is a beginner or intermediate or advanced, what does that really mean? What are they able to do with that information, with the language? Now, there are some other scales here, and I'm going to put this here in the chat. Hope this will work. Yeah, okay, so I think I got all of them in there. So I'm putting these here in the chat. And also, I'm just going to say, if you are not familiar with how to save information that's in the chat, when underneath the chat where you can type your own message, there are 3 dots on the right-hand side where it says more. And if you click on that, it'll pop up saying save chat. So that way, when you leave the meeting, you'll be able to save this chat with you. So these are some other different proficiency scales. So CASAS and CEFR we just looked at, but there's also at the national level in the United States Department of Education, along with the American Institute for Research, came up with an English language proficiency standards for adult education that has 5 levels, which you can see at that PDF link. And those standards are actually aligned with the career and college readiness standards. And then in Texas, we have Texas Adult Education and Literacy Content Standards, which have 6 levels of proficiency. And if you've ever taught a foreign language, you might be familiar with ACTFL, which is the American Council of Teachers of Foreign Languages. And this one is very widely used for foreign language teachers, French and Spanish, etc. But also they have proficiency for standards for English as well. So there are a number of different proficiency skills out there. And so again, I encourage you to look at a couple of them, read through them, get more familiar with them, so that you better understand what is meant when we say that a student is beginner or intermediate or advanced proficiency level. So with that said, we're going to go now into the discussion of differentiation. Does anyone have any questions before we move on to that about proficiency scales? Okay, so proficiency is one reason that we might have a multi-level class, but it's not the only reason. There are other reasons why students differ in the class and other things that we might need to consider in differentiation. So one is the student's previous level of experience in education. We know that some students might come to us, particularly if they are refugees. They may not have ever been in a classroom before, or they have very limited experience in a classroom. And it could be hard for them to sit in a classroom for 2 or 3 hours at a time because they're not used to sitting in this kind of formal environment and learning from someone who is teaching in a very decontextualized way. So their previous educational experience and related to that is their level of literacy. So some students will come in, they could be very proficient in speaking. They might have been living in the United States for a long time and have really great oral skills, but then when it comes to reading and writing, they're really not able to use literacy. Cultural differences can also lead to differentiation. Some students might feel when they come to the class that in their culture, the teacher is a person of authority, and they expect that the teacher is going to provide all the information, and they as a student, they're going to sit there and they're going to listen. So they might interact or participate in a different way because of their cultural background. And they might also have different expectations about the roles of the teacher and the roles of students, again, because of their culture. Culture might affect how they interact with other classmates too. If they come from conservative Muslim countries, they might not feel comfortable interacting with students of the opposite gender. So that might lead us to differentiate when it comes to how we form our groups. We might want to put the female students together and male students together. So that also influences how we're going to conduct our classroom activities. Their first language can affect how we differentiate. Of course, you might have a mixed group with students from lots of different backgrounds, or you could have students that kind of cluster, like a group of Spanish students, a group of Chinese students, a group of Arabic speaking students. And first language can also affect how quickly students can learn English because of the similarities or differences between their first language and English. So Spanish speakers, there's a lot of similarities between the two languages, that they both use the same writing system. There are a lot of cognates between the two languages. But if you look at like Arabic and English, or let's say some of the languages from Afghanistan and English, they use a different writing system. There are different language families. So there are some really big differences between the languages. And so that can also require us to do more differentiation because of that first language. The level of cultural adaptation, we know that some students have just arrived. They're still getting adjusted. They don't really feel comfortable speaking out in front of the whole class. They're going to be more shy. And then others who have been here for a long time, as I said, they feel very comfortable interacting. They've adapted somewhat to our cultural norms in the United States. They're used to participating in groups, and they're used to this idea of students being active in the classroom. So their level of cultural adaptation will also influence how that differentiation goes for us. We know that students are going to have different personalities, some people more outgoing, some people more introverted, some people more analytical, some people more big picture. That's going to influence how we differentiate. And there are reasons for learning English. We know some people are really concerned about getting a job, getting promoted in their job. Others might be stay-at-home moms, and they want to be able to take their children to the doctors, interact with their children's teachers. So our students have a lot of different reasons for learning English, which can also feed into differentiation. Students are going to be different ages. You might have some younger students that maybe have just graduated from high school, or they're young adults, and up to senior citizens. And this also relates to the reasons for learning English. Those younger students might be very concerned about getting a job, whereas the older students, if they're already retired, that's not going to be their motivator. So if you're always talking about getting a job, that's not going to be appealing for them because they've already retired from the workforce. And then also physical abilities, that some students are going to have some physical challenges that might affect how they're able to participate in the class and what they're able to do. Back to age, some older students might have hearing difficulties or vision difficulties that we might need to differentiate the activities to accommodate those differences. So proficiency level is not the only thing we need to be concerned about when we think about differentiation. There are other factors or other reasons we may need to differentiate. So differentiation, here's a definition from Tomlinson, who was actually one of the first people to really write on this topic for general education. And she said here that in differentiated classrooms, teachers begin where students are, not the front of a curriculum guide. So they don't just start on page 1 of the book and plow through the book. They do an analysis, and I'm sure you talked about that in the previous session. They did an analysis to see, what are students interested in learning? What do they need to learn? What is their level now? And then they build from that. They accept and build upon the premise that learners differ in important ways. Thus, they also accept and act on the premise that teachers must be ready to engage students in instruction through different learning modalities, by appealing to different interests, and by using varied rates of instruction along with varied degrees of complexity. And that's what we are going to be looking at now. How can we differ by modality, interest, rates of instruction, and levels of complexity? So differentiation can be divided into kind of 3 different elements. First, the content that is being taught, the process that students follow, and then also the product that students produce at the end. We're going to talk about each one of these now. So content refers to students being exposed to different information, different content via different materials. So it could be materials of different modalities, like written material versus audio material or visual material, or even different information, like one person they could have articles from a newspaper on 2 different topics. Learning objectives for these different activities and different students may also differ. So some examples of differentiating content would be if you divide students into groups and one group is working on phonics because they're still at the literacy level. So they might be looking at digraphs like ch versus sh, while another group that is more proficient is reading a brochure, an authentic material about recycling in the community. So they are working on different texts. They have different objectives for what they're doing. So this would be an example of differentiating by content. Another example would be that one group reads about recycling while another group watches a video about recycling. So even though it is the same subject, they are getting exposed to different information and it's in a different modality. And a third example, students use technology to listen to different dialogues or podcasts online. And there are so many materials that are online for students to do self-directed or individualized learning. And it's great if we can direct students to those materials, and also if we can use them in the class, if we're able to use a computer lab, or if students have their phones, they can also engage in that kind of independent or individualized learning. So the second dimension of the differentiation is the process of learning. So here we're talking about students might be using similar materials and they might be working towards similar objectives, but the way in which they engage with those materials, or the actual process in the activity, the actual steps that they follow or things that they do are a little bit different. So some examples of this is in reading, you might have 3 groups where one group is reading a text silently, while another group is reading that text aloud with a buddy, like taking turns reading sentence by sentence. Because they are still working on decoding and they need to have that support as they are reading. And other students might be reading silently while they are listening to a recording of the text because they need that additional level of support to hear someone reading, a fluent, proficient speaker reading while they read along. Another example of process is in a vocabulary exercise. So all the students are working with the same set of vocabulary words, but some of them are writing or saying the definition of a word. So let's say it's mechanic. So it's like, hey, what is a mechanic? What does a mechanic do? And they explain it orally or in writing. While another group of students could be matching words and definitions. So the definitions are already given and they have to choose a word from a word bank, or maybe it's a matching exercise. And then a third group could be matching the word and with pictures, like the word mechanic with pictures of a mechanic. So they are using the same vocabulary and they are all working on understanding that vocabulary. They have similar learning objectives, but they are engaging with that vocabulary in different ways, depending on their proficiency level or those other factors I mentioned. And then the third way that we can differentiate is through the product that students will produce at the end. So students do have similar learning objectives, but they demonstrate their achievement of those objectives in different ways. And so an example of that would be after reading a story, some students might write a summary of the text, while other students might draw a comic strip of the main events in the story. So this could be differentiation because of proficiency level, but we also know that students have different learning styles, they have different abilities, and this also speaks to that. Some students just have different preferences. There could be some students that are very artistic and they prefer to express themselves that way. Another example is after researching a career, some students might write a report, so a written report of what they learned in their research. Some students might create a poster that has text and illustrations that they can present to the class or hang on the wall. And then other students develop a PowerPoint and they give an oral presentation about what they learned. So they're even incorporating some technology into the product that they produce at the end. So again, we can differentiate through the content, the process, or the product, but we don't have to differentiate in all of them in every class with every activity, but just to consider as we're going through our lesson planning, how we can differentiate using these different approaches. So let's look at some other examples, but specifically for different skill areas. And I'm just going to pause for a moment here talking and see if there's any questions in the chat. Has anyone posted? Anyone want to post a question in the chat? I'm just checking. Okay. So with this example for reading, there are a number of websites that are online where a news article from current events is actually broken down into different levels. And I'm going to put these in the chat here for you as well. I'll have to do it at the end when I finish talking. But one of them is News and Levels. And that website takes the same article and divides it into 3 different levels. So there is a lower level, intermediate level, and advanced level, which is closer to what the authentic article, the original article, how that was written. So the text itself is broken down into different levels. So it's simplified in the grammar, it's simplified in the vocabulary, but then also the exercises that accompany these texts are also simplified and differentiated. Another website is Breaking News English that also has reading in different levels, and it has 7 levels, but not every reading is in all 7 levels. So some readings might be levels 1, 2, 3, and other readings might be levels 5, 6, 7. So they're still kind of targeted toward either lower proficiency or upper proficiency, but they are divided into levels within that proficiency level. So you might want to look at these. These are some things that you could use in class, but you might also direct students to these websites if they can determine what their level is, or you might help them determine which level they should select on these websites. Then they could do some independent work also, reading at their own level. So Angela mentions Rewordify. Yeah, so does that simplifies the text that you paste in, I believe? Yes, okay. So when you, so imagine that you've selected the text for learners. They might be reading the same text, but you might differentiate what they do with the text, again, that process. And so some ways to do that is giving multiple choice questions, which are less complex. So with the multiple choice question, the student already has some answers to choose from. Short answer questions, which are more complex because students have to write an answer, or writing a summary of the text. So they have to be able to pick out the main ideas and pick out some important details, and then actually construct the response to write the summary. So you might be able to differentiate by choosing text of different levels, but also even if students are all reading the same text, you can differentiate what they do with that text afterwards. Another example with reading is using jigsaw readings on a theme. So I just want to explain how a jigsaw works. So let's say that your theme is the environment. So your unit is something about the environment. And in my examples here, I often give examples of 3 groups that you have: group A, B, and C. But when you talk about differentiation, you might not always have 3 groups. Maybe you only have 2 groups. Maybe you have 4 groups. It really depends on how big your class is, and also the levels, the differences between the students in your class. So I've been giving examples with 3 groups, but I just want to point out it's not always 3 groups. So let's say the theme is the environment, and group A is going to read a text from your book on air pollution. So that's what I mean by an ESL text, is that it was written for ESL learners. It was written with them in mind. Whereas group B reads a modified authentic text. Maybe it was something you found on the internet, a news article, but you have simplified it. Maybe you use Rewordify that Angela recommends. You use that to simplify the text so that it is a modified authentic text. And this one's on water pollution. And then group C reads an authentic text, so it has not been modified at all. It is the original text from a newspaper, from the website, on animals and climate change. So here the students are reading 3 different texts. The text is at their level, but the texts are all on a similar theme. And so how the jigsaw works then is that students read their texts, and then they get with the other students who read their same text and read and discuss, make sure they comprehend what they've read, and they answer comprehension questions. And so the groups look like then A, so all the A's are together, B, all the B's together, C, all the C's are together. And after you are sure that students comprehend whatever they've read in those groups, the next step then is for them to create multi-reading groups. So new groups are formed with one person from each of those other groups, from one person that has read each of the other texts. So that's going to look like then in the groups ABC, ABC, ABC. And so at this point now, they have different pieces of information. They've read different texts, and then they can get together in these new groups and discuss a different question that will draw on their knowledge of reading these different texts. So this is one way to differentiate for reading that also involves a lot of discussion and interaction with classmates. Yeah, so someone has commented here about differentiating content, the topics. Yeah, especially when students have different goals. So students who are, for example, interested in getting a job might be wanting to read a lot about their field, and people who are parents might be wanting to read more about news in the schools and parenting advice, things like this. So differentiating by the content, depending on their interests, their cultural backgrounds. Yeah, definitely. There's so much we can do. I think we're very lucky as a field that we can just bring in so many different topics in ESL. So another example of differentiation for listening. So let's say you have the text, the listening text that comes from your textbook, or maybe it's authentic listening. So to differentiate this, maybe some students listen and write notes just freehand. Maybe other students complete an outline of the information in that listening or some sort of chart. And then maybe others have a list of topics, different topics, and as they listen, they check off what they actually hear mentioned. So we see that the first task is much more complex, and then the middle text is more intermediate level, less complexity, and then the final one is the we say easiest one, that students don't really have to write anything, they just have to listen and check off what they hear. One thing to consider when you are doing listening activities in class is think about if it's possible for students to listen on their own individual devices. So if you're in a computer lab, or if students have phones, maybe they can listen on their own devices. And there are some textbooks, and I have here Ventures, and Ventures, if you've used it, I know it's very common, textbook. Ventures has these QR codes in the book where students can take a picture or use the QR code to go to the listening and listen to it on their own phones. So that's great for differentiation, because when students can listen on individual devices, they can listen to the same text as many times as they need to. They can listen multiple times. Very often, if it's something that's like a YouTube video or a TED Talk, they can even control the speed of how fast or how slow the person is speaking. And also students can enable captions in English, and sometimes even enable captions in their L1. So there are some supports that students are able to access when they listen on their own that we aren't necessarily able to access when we present it to the entire class, because the whole group is listening at the same time. So do consider how you might allow students to complete listening on their own individual devices when you're in class. And my third example is for a writing or speaking activity. So let's say we have a prompt, describe your family. Those more proficient students are obviously going to be able to produce more language. So the more proficient student might be able to write a paragraph or speak for a longer period of time. The less proficient students might just be able to write individual sentence or speak for a shorter time. And then those lowest proficiency students, they might need some scaffolding, such as having sentence frames that they can just complete the sentences and then copy them over again. Or if they're speaking, they can complete the sentences and then read them aloud. So in this way, all the students can address the same topic, but they have different levels of support for doing that. And if we can incorporate more open-ended activities, not just activities from our textbook, but activities where students are generating the information, that actually allows for students to really participate at their own level. So some examples of this would be interview activities, where as a whole class, you generate a set of questions, and then students can select particular questions and interview a partner or mingle around and ask the same question to everyone in the class. Dialogue journals are also a good way for students to be able to participate at their own level for writing. And the way a dialogue journal works is students have a journal, and they could be open-ended entries that students can write about anything, or you might assign a topic. But with dialogue journals, the whole purpose is to develop fluency in writing. So whatever students write, it's not corrected with, you don't correct their grammar with a red pen, but the teacher does read what students have written and then writes comments to them based on whatever they've said. So if they talk about something they did on the weekend, or their new pet, or just problems they're having at work, you would respond just like you would to someone, in an email or on a chat. You would respond back to the content of what they have written, and not looking at the form or the structure of the sentences. Because if you focus on the form, then that could inhibit students from writing, and we want them to be able to develop that fluency. Sometimes if students don't know a word, they might write the word in their first language. They can draw pictures if they would like in the dialogue journal. So it's a dialogue because it's a dialogue between the teacher and the student. And it's also a good way to learn about our students' lives, but also it's differentiated because each student is going to be able to write at their own level and not be concerned about writing the same thing or writing on the same topic as other students in the class. You might also have dialogue journals where students exchange the journals with each other, but sometimes there are privacy issues, and so students might not like to do that. But it is very helpful for them to exchange these journals with the teacher, so that the teacher and the student get to know each other and develop that relationship. Something else that is individual is using individually compiled vocabulary notebooks. So where students have their own notebook where they add the words that are new to them or that are important to them, words that they would like to know. And there are different ways of organizing that, but usually they include the word and the part of speech, a definition, an example sentence, and they might quiz themselves on their own vocabulary words. You might create things like Quizlets to help students quiz themselves on their words. And there are also some other apps where students can input their own words and quiz themselves on their individual words. So something like that, an individual vocabulary notebook, can help foster that vocabulary acquisition. We know when students come to our classes, they've had so many different life experiences that what's a new word for one person is very well-known word for another classmate. So they come with very different ranges of vocabulary. So everyone can work on vocabulary at their own level this way. And extensive reading is when students have a library of books to choose from, and they're able to choose books at their own level, and they just read those books for leisure and enjoyment. It's helpful for teachers to help students to choose which books might be at their own level. And preferably they would choose a book that's a little bit easy for them. So that way they can just enjoy reading fluently and not get hung up on trying to understand every word or feeling frustrated because there's so many words that they don't know. So extensive reading does require having some materials either in your classroom or in the school library that students can access that are at different levels, and also materials that cover a wide range of topics so everyone can find something that they are interested in reading. So there's also a lot of literature out there about extensive reading programs and how they encourage reading fluency and developing a love of reading. And finally, I'll talk about project-based learning. And what we have here is a picture from the Aberg Center for Literacy, which was in Dallas. Now it has merged with LIFT, but they used to do projects where the students would do a presentation in class about a hobby or something that they could teach others how to do. And they would create a poster, and they would also bring some realia to the class and model this activity, this hobby for the other people in the class and how to do it. So this particular student had a hobby or a kind of a side business where she did balloon decorations. And so she made this poster about balloon decorations, and you can see from the background, she has the pictures on there, and there is some text, but there's not actually a lot of writing on it. So we might imagine that this student is kind of at like a high beginner level. She doesn't have a lot of text here, but she's able to use that poster then as a foundation for her presentation. She can talk through the different pictures and what they reflect about her hobby. And then she also brought some balloons and showed the classmates how to create different forms with the balloons. Sometimes some of the other students also did projects related to cooking and demonstrating how to create a meal in their culture. So there could be projects about all kinds of things. If your program is more work-oriented, they might research different occupations that they're interested in. They could research like how to pursue their education towards this particular occupational goal that they have. They could, research different schools if they're interested to send their child to a different school. Project-based learning can be about really anything that you want. And it really encourages differentiation because their students can research different topics. They can follow different processes as they develop their projects. And then at the end, they're going to have different products as well. So really project-based learning is that ideal, perfect form of differentiation. So you have seen in all of these examples that I've given how grouping is so important when we talk about differentiation. And so some criteria that we might use when we are differentiating is to think about the student's proficiency level, and do we want to put students together who are the same proficiency level? In the reading examples that I gave, where you have one group that is working on phonics, where another group is reading authentic materials, in that case, it would be really important for the students to be with other students who are at the same proficiency level. Whereas other activities, it might be helpful if they're in mixed group of students with different proficiency levels. So where you have one student who's more proficient and another student who is less proficient, so that that more proficient student can help that lower proficiency student. So for example, for the reading, I had the buddy reading as one example. And in that case, the more proficient student would be able to help that lower proficiency student decode as they were reading aloud. So we need to think about then what's the ideal grouping when we put students in groups. Should they be same proficiency or different proficiency? Another consideration is their first language. As I said before, we might have a mix of students. We might have everyone from the same background. But if we had students like a group of students who spoke Spanish, a group who spoke Chinese, and a group who spoke Arabic, there could be some occasion where we might want to group them by their same first language so that they could help each other to complete a task. So those more proficient students could explain in their first language to the lower proficiency students, what are we doing? What are the steps, and any questions that they have about how to complete the task. And a final point related to grouping is that we might want to assign the students a particular role or a task within their group. Instead of just saying, okay, get in a group and do this activity, we might want to give them specific jobs that each person can complete, and then assigning those jobs based on their proficiency level. So if a person is very good at writing and has very good literacy skills, we might ask that person to be the writer and who's going to write out the answers for that group, or who's going to write out on the poster that group is going to present. Another person who has the higher level of oral skills, and that person who's more extroverted can be the reporter, and they get up and stand up in front of the class and they explain what the group has done and what the group has written. The person who is the more shy person or the lower proficiency student could be the timekeeper, just to make sure that they're on task and that they're completing the task in the time allotted. And if you have somebody who's really good at art, but maybe they don't like to write as much, then they could be the illustrator for the activity. Really, it depends on what the activity is or what the task is, what kinds of roles that you would assign learners. But assigning roles is another way that when students are working in groups that you can differentiate what each person is responsible for. So you will see then that when we have all these factors to consider with differentiation, so it's something that needs to be at the forefront of our mind during our lesson planning process. So when we think about our lesson objectives, are all the students going to be working toward the same objectives, or are there some students that need to really focus on their own objectives? Like if we have the lower literacy students that need to really develop those literacy skills, maybe they are going to have some objectives that are just for them, whereas the other objectives are for the entire class. So thinking about the objectives for the lesson and whether they need to be differentiated, looking at the materials. We talked about having readings of different proficiency levels. So where are we going to get those, and make sure we're bringing those for the students. If we are going to have that jigsaw reading, having those different readings on the same topics, or if we have, we need to use technology to be able to differentiate. So the activities that we actually do, the process that different students will follow. Okay, my phone is ringing, so just a second. I'm gonna turn this off here. All right. So the activities that students are going to complete and the grouping, as we just talked about, is going to be really important to think about during lesson planning. So I would suggest that you write out on your lesson plan who is going to be in which group, and then the timing for the activities. So some students are going to need more time to complete an activity because of their proficiency level, and other students are going to zip through that activity. So we might actually have, when we're planning the lesson and we think about timing, we could have one group that does 2 activities in 10 minutes, whereas another group only does 1 activity in that same 10-minute time frame. So thinking about that during the lesson planning, how that timing is going to work for the different groups and the activities that they're engaged in. So a good format to follow when we have differentiated activities is to start out with the whole class activity, doing those icebreaker activities as a whole class, introducing the objectives for that class, what the theme of the unit is going to be, and then breaking into the differentiated activities, which could be different groups for different activities. And then when we get to the end of the lesson, coming back again as a whole class and doing another whole class review or a whole class recap of the lesson. So in this way, students actually feel like they're part of a class. They don't feel like they came to this room and then they're doing individual activities for the entire time, but they feel like they are a part of a larger class. And also it provides some cohesion to the class or unification to the class, because they start out as a whole class, and then they break up into their groups and they come back again at the end as a whole class. So it creates a structure to the class where that is a unified, cohesive lesson. So since I've been talking about multi-level classes, I'd also like to share some tips that I think a program can follow that can help reduce the amount of multi-levelness that they have in their classes. You're never going to get away from it totally, because as some people have said, every class is a multi-level class. There are just so many differences between students. You're never going to have this like uniform class where everyone is exactly the same. But there are some things that programs can do to reduce, let's say, misplacement, where students are in the wrong level and they could be in a level that better meets their needs. So the first is to adopt a proficiency scale for use in your program. And so those are the proficiency scales that I mentioned earlier. if your program can adopt one of those scales to use as a reference point for the levels in their program, for the textbooks that they select, for their curriculum, that will help everyone to be on the same page and to be thinking about proficiency in the same way. And how, what does that mean for someone to be a beginner, intermediate, or advanced? When is a person ready to move from one level to the next level? It can help to have those descriptors to guide our thinking about proficiency. Use a standardized placement procedure for placing students in your program. You might only have 2 levels, and that's fine. You still need a standardized placement procedure. And so what I mean, I'll give an example from my own experience when I have been volunteering in an adult literacy program. There were different people who manned their registration every day. And so in the morning, there would be one person doing the registration. In the afternoon, a different person. On Monday, there's a different person than Tuesday. And they would all do the placement a little bit differently. That sometimes they would give the students a written test first, and then the oral interview, or they do the oral interview first and then the written test. And then when they came to the oral interview, they would just talk to them. Oh, hi, how are you? Where are you from? Tell me about your family. But sometimes they would ask the different people who were doing the placement would ask different questions. So they were getting different kinds of responses from the students. So it wasn't really possible to compare the proficiency level of the students because they were really giving different answers to different questions. So using a standardized placement procedure will allow you to be better able to compare the proficiency level of the different students who are coming to your program. Ask questions on your placement tests that reach the upper level of students' language proficiency. And so what I mean is, don't ask those just easy questions, right? Ask challenging questions. A lot of people, they ask those basic questions. Where are you from? How long have you been here? Where do you work? And students can give answers to those kinds of questions pretty easily. Those are pretty formulaic kinds of questions that students might be able to really fluently respond to those kinds of questions. But when you ask them something else, then they draw a blank because they've memorized the answers to those other questions, but they can't really speak beyond that. So think about what is taught in your program. What are the different levels in your program? And what is taught at each level? And try to stretch students to cover those different levels. So for example, don't just ask them questions in simple present time. Ask them questions about the past to see if they can use past time. Ask them questions about the future to see if they can talk about future. Ask them hypothetical questions. What would you do if? To see if they can talk about things that are more abstract and hypothetical. You might even use some pictures to help stimulate students' discussion and language production. So try to challenge them so you can really see where is the edge of their proficiency, because that's where you will want to place them. You don't want to get them in a class that's too easy. And also to collect samples of students' speech and writing. If we just rely on their conversational skills, we'll miss out on understanding their use of literacy and their ability with literacy. So it's important to see how fluent they are in speaking, but also how fluent they are in writing, because sometimes there's a discrepancy there. The students could be very fluent speaking, but don't have literacy skills. And it also happens the opposite way as well, that some students may have studied English in their countries for a long time, but they have very good reading and writing skills, but they have never really heard English or had the opportunity to speak it. So they don't have that oral fluency. So it's important to collect samples of their speech and writing to better place them in the appropriate level. So I'd like to ask a question now to you all. Are there some ways that you differentiate your instruction, and how do you do that? If anybody like to unmute and share. I do see one question about assigning roles and what happens if students aren't prepared. I would say, if you know that about them, then maybe you need to assign them a role like timekeeper. So if they don't have anything prepared, then they can be the timekeeper for the group. Anybody like to share? Yes.
I often will read an article. This is for the high intermediates up, just to find out where they are. I'll read an article from the news and then ask them to summarize it orally. They're just listening, that's all. And you can find out a lot about their understanding through that.
Yeah, that sounds like a really good task to use on a placement exam. Okay, well, these were some of the references that I looked at related to differentiation. Betsy Paris has a great book on teaching adult ESL. And then Tomlinson was one of the first people, as I said, who really wrote about differentiation. There's actually a second edition of this book, which is 2014, I think. So these are two great references related to differentiation. And my contact information is here. The top one is my personal email, and the second one is my university email.
I appreciate those resources, because my reaction is that with a group of volunteers who aren't professional TESOLers, this is very overwhelming. I mean, in my studies, I learned about this stuff, but even now as a retired professional and volunteer, it's like, oh my gosh, that sounds so hard to do. And I mean, we use really good curriculum to make it easy for the teachers. And I do think this is definitely worth, considering and doing, but it just seems so overwhelming. So I do appreciate, like, I knew about breaking news, but I'd kind of forgotten about it, and different materials like that are kind of easy to find and use are very helpful, because it just seems overwhelming to do some of these to plan for some of and prepare for some of these ways of differentiation. I don't know if anybody
yeah, so yeah, I again emphasize that you don't have to do every kind of differentiation in every lesson with every activity. Just choose the one thing. And also in terms of materials, once you have those materials created for one class, you'll be able to use them again in the future with other classes. But yeah, it does involve more thought, in the lesson planning. You can't just grab the book and say, okay, we're doing unit 1 now. You have to really think through the lesson, what your objectives are, and what your students need to get out of that lesson.